Welcome to the Technology Risk Practice Series from the AI Mock Interviewer Question Bank. Technology Risk Part 1. This episode has 13 questions. For each question, take a moment to think through your own answer before I share a strong approach. Question 1. Technology Risk. Technology Risk Framework. How would you design an enterprise technology risk management framework for cloud, applications, infrastructure, SDLC, and third-party integrations? Here's a strong way to approach it. Build the framework around a consistent risk taxonomy and scoring methodology applied uniformly across domains, cloud, applications, infrastructure, SDLC, vendors, with a central risk register capturing identified risks, owners, and mitigation status regardless of which domain they originate from. Embed risk assessment checkpoints directly into existing processes, architecture review, change management, vendor onboarding, rather than as a separate parallel process, so risk identification happens naturally as part of how work already gets done. Nice. Let's continue. Question 2. Technology risk. Risk assessment. A product team is launching a new customer-facing platform on GCP or GKE. How would you assess technology risk from BRD or PRD through architecture review, build, release, and operations? Here's a strong way to approach it. Assess risk at each stage with different focus. At BRD or PRD, identify data sensitivity and compliance requirements early since they shape architecture. At architecture review, evaluate the design against security and reliability standards before build starts. During build, verify controls, IAM, secrets management, testing, are actually implemented as designed. At release, confirm production readiness gates pass. And in operations, monitor that the controls remain effective over time rather than assuming a one-time review is sufficient for an evolving system. Great. Moving on. Question 3. Controls. Control design. For a regulated cloud platform, define preventive, detective, and corrective controls for IAM, network exposure, CI or CD, secrets, vulnerability management, and production changes. Here's a strong way to approach it. Preventive controls stop bad outcomes before they happen. Org policies blocking public IPs, required approvals in CI or CD, binary authorization blocking unsigned images. Detective controls identify issues that occurred, audit logging, security command center findings, vulnerability scan results. Corrective controls fix identified issues, automated remediation workflows, incident response procedures, patch management SLAs. A mature program has all three layered together for each risk area, not just preventive controls alone. Alright, next question. Question 4. Governance or compliance. Framework mapping. How would you map ISO 27001, NIST, COBIT, and FAIR requirements to practical cloud and DevOps controls without creating checkbox compliance? Here's a strong way to approach it. Build a single control matrix that maps each practical technical control, workload identity, binary authorization, audit logging to the specific requirements it satisfies across all four frameworks simultaneously. So implementing one good control gets credit everywhere it applies rather than teams implementing redundant, framework-specific checkbox controls. Focus conversations with engineering teams on the actual risk being mitigated, not the framework citation. So the controls are adopted because they are genuinely useful, not just to pass an audit. Let's keep going. Question 5. Audit or remediation. Audit remediation. An external audit finds weak access reviews, missing evidence, and delayed patching. How would you create a remediation plan? Owners, due dates, risk acceptance, and reporting. Here's a strong way to approach it. Break each finding into a discrete remediation item with a named owner, a realistic due date agreed with that owner, not imposed unilaterally, and clear evidence requirements for closure so it can't be marked done without proof. For findings that genuinely can't be fixed on the audit's timeline, document formal risk acceptance signed by an appropriate risk owner rather than letting it quietly slip, and report progress to leadership on a recurring cadence so remediation stays visible and doesn't stall once audit attention moves elsewhere. On to the next one. Question 6. Incident risk. Incident risk analysis. A production incident was fixed quickly, But the same failure could repeat. How would you analyze root cause, systemic risk, control failure, and long-term mitigation? Here's a strong way to approach it. Go beyond the immediate technical trigger to ask why the system allowed that trigger to cause an outage. Was there a missing control, an untested assumption, or a gap in monitoring that let it go undetected longer than it should have? Classify it as a systemic risk if the same underlying gap could produce different failure modes elsewhere, not just a repeat of this exact incident, and define long-term mitigation as a permanent guardrail, automated test, policy enforcement, architectural change, rather than a manual process that relies on someone remembering. Good. Here's another one. Question 7. Risk reporting. Cloud risk dashboard. Design a technology risk dashboard for senior leadership. What CREs, control metrics, exceptions, trends, and escalation signals would you include? Here's a strong way to approach it. Include key risk indicators like number of critical or high findings open beyond SLA, percentage of assets with required controls verified, and incident frequency or severity trend over time, alongside control metrics showing what's actually being enforced, patch compliance rate, access review completion rate, surface open exceptions with their expiry dates prominently so nothing quietly becomes permanent, show trend direction, improving or worsening rather than just point-in-time snapshots, and define clear escalation thresholds so leadership knows exactly when a metric crossing a line requires their direct involvement. Nice. Let's continue. Question 8. Risk automation. Risk automation. What parts of technology risk assessment and reporting would you automate using cloud logs, CI or CD metadata, vulnerability scanners, policy as code, and ticketing workflows? Here's a strong way to approach it. Automate the data collection and initial triage, pulling vulnerability scan results, policy as code violations, and CI or CD deployment metadata automatically into a central risk register rather than manually compiling spreadsheets, and auto-creating tickets with SLA timers for new findings. Keep human judgment for risk scoring context, prioritization trade-offs, and any decision involving risk acceptance. Since automation is excellent at surfacing and tracking findings consistently but shouldn't be making business risk tolerance decisions on its own. Great. Moving on. Question 9. Leadership or behavioral? Behavioral risk leadership. Tell me about a time you had to influence engineering or product teams to fix a technology risk they did not initially prioritize. Here's a strong way to approach it. Structure this as a specific story. Describe the risk and why the team initially deprioritized it. Competing deadlines. Not seeing the business impact. Explain how you reframed the conversation around concrete impact and consequences rather than just citing policy, and describe the specific action that shifted their prioritization, often data, a relatable scenario, or connecting the risk to something they already cared about. Close with the outcome and what you learned about influencing without direct authority. Alright, next question. Question 10. Stakeholder management. Stakeholder communication. How would you explain a critical cloud security risk to senior leadership in business impact language without overwhelming them with technical detail? Here's a strong way to approach it. Lead with what could happen in business terms. Data exposure affecting X customers. Potential regulatory fine. Service outage risk before any technical explanation. And use a simple analogy only if it aids understanding rather than technical accuracy for its own sake. State clearly what you're asking for: budget, a policy decision, time, and the consequence of inaction, keeping the technical root cause to 1 or 2 sentences that support the business case rather than being the focus of the conversation. Let's keep going. Question 11. Decision making, conflict handling. Product wants to release quickly, security wants stricter controls, and engineering says the control adds toil. How would you drive a decision? Here's a strong way to approach it. Get specific data from each side, the actual risk the control mitigates, the actual delay it introduces, and the actual toil it creates, rather than letting the disagreement stay at the level of competing opinions, and look for a middle path, an automated version of the control that removes the toil, or a phased rollout that gets most of the risk reduction without the full delay. If no middle path exists, Make the trade-off explicit and escalate to whoever owns that risk decision with a clear recommendation, rather than letting the standoff continue indefinitely. On to the next one. Question 12. Stakeholder management. Trusted advisor. Describe how you would build trust with IT, engineering, product, security, audit, and business stakeholders as a technology risk lead. Here's a strong way to approach it. Build trust by being consistently useful rather than only showing up with findings. Help teams understand risk in terms relevant to their goals. Follow through reliably on commitments. And avoid surprising people with escalations they didn't see coming. Show technical credibility by understanding their actual systems and constraints, not just citing frameworks. And be willing to say a risk is acceptable when it genuinely is, since a risk function that never says yes loses credibility fast. Good. Here's another one. Question 13. Leadership or behavioral. Prioritization. You have critical audit findings, recurring incidents, and a weak risk dashboard. How would you prioritize the next 30, 60, and 90 days? Here's a strong way to approach it. Days 0-30. Address critical audit findings with hard deadlines or active exploitability first, since those carry the most immediate consequence. Days 30-60. Dig into the recurring incidents to find and fix the systemic root cause rather than continuing to firefight symptoms. Days 60-90. Build out the risk dashboard and reporting cadence so future prioritization is data-driven rather than reactive, establishing the visibility that prevents the next 90 days from looking the same. Nice. Let's continue. That wraps up this episode. Nice work practicing, and see you in the next one.